congratulations. Got to learn some of that today. So again, thank you for taking your time, and we'll be talking soon.
My name is Christopher Snell. I'm a scientific director at the Workwell Foundation. How we got into this is somewhat of a convoluted route. Our background is exercise physiology. We come out of a sports science background. And many years ago, so sometimes over 25 years ago, we came up with the idea that we could possibly evaluate function in fatiguing illnesses using cardiopulmonary exercise testing, which is widely used for evaluating athlete performance. We published a few papers. We were making a presentation at a conference in Seattle, and an attorney came up to us and said, have you ever thought about doing these cardiopulmonary exercise tests for the purpose of disability evaluation? Well, as it happens, we hadn't, but that was a long time ago, and it's a lot of water flown under the bridge since then, but we've done hundreds and hundreds of disability evaluations and have worked with Kantor and Kantor for a long, long time, very successfully. And we're going to try and outline some of the process for you here. And we're also going to be linking that. So primarily we were working with fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome, but it appears that what we do may be applicable to COVID. So we'll be linking COVID-19 throughout our presentation.
Hey, Austin, is this still you?
So yes, we thought we would start with Dr. Snell to give his perspectives, and then we'll segue into Andrew as we speak about how that relates to his work on the legal side of things. So here we go.
Okay, and next slide. Increasingly, when we see insurance companies' responses to claims for fatiguing illnesses like ME/CFS, that many of these insurance policies have what they call a nervous disorder exclusion. I've added the ME/CFS up there because essentially it appears to me it's an ME/CFS exclusion. And it's this idea that once you go beyond 2 years for any disability, if they can attribute that disability in any way, shape, or form to a mental disorder, but not including but not limited to anxiety, depression, stress. Interestingly, they throw fatigue, exhaustion in there as well, which I don't see as nervous system disorders, and psychiatric complications. So it's the catch-22. Essentially, our goal is to combat this nervous system disorder exclusion to the benefit of our clients. So a key feature of ME/CFS, and it may be unique to the disease, is a condition called post-exertional malaise. It's the idea that after somebody's exerted themselves physically, emotionally, cognitively, that they suffer a relapse. It precipitates symptoms. So anybody that suffers from the illness will know what it's like to have a crash and maybe not recover for a day, 2 days, 3 days, a week, and sometimes it can be months. So this idea that post-exertional malaise is a cardinal feature of ME/CFS. It occurs, it's one of the most limiting factors for people to function, both socially, emotionally, and primarily for our purposes in the workplace. Sorry, can you just keep with that slide? Just thank you. Not surprisingly, people who experience post-exertional malaise, as with many chronic illnesses, also have a greater burden of psychological distress. So the sicker people are, the more likely they will experience depression or related emotional turmoil for any number of reasons. Where we need to make the argument is that any depression, stress, anxiety that people are experiencing is secondary to the symptoms of the illness and not primary. So what we do cardiopulmonary exercise testing. It's considered the gold standard for functional assessment. You've probably all seen pictures of athletes on a treadmill, on a stationary bike, with a mouthpiece on, a tube coming out of their mouth, and they're pedaling away till they can't pedal anymore. Essentially, what we're doing is we're monitoring their usage of oxygen as an indicator of how much energy they're using and how efficient they produce the energy. So cardiopulmonary exercise testing monitors a number of factors: cardiovascular, respiratory, and recovery responses, workload, effort, and metabolic responses. Our contribution to the field was to develop what we call the two-day cardiopulmonary exercise test, where we give a cardiopulmonary exercise test on day one, and then 24 hours later, we give a second test. What we found was that in many instances, people with fatiguing illnesses cannot duplicate their performance on the second day. This is extremely unusual. Most normal individuals, most pathological conditions, even deconditioned individuals can reproduce cardiopulmonary exercise testing results reliably within 24 hours. So we have proposed that cardiopulmonary exercise testing provides an objective way to document post-exertional malaise in ME/CFS patients. So the objective evidence. So cardiopulmonary exercising testing can differentiate between pulmonary, cardiac, neurologic, muscular, and psychological basis for dyspnea, so breathlessness. So what we see, anybody that exerts themselves to an extreme will become breathless, tightness in the chest, struggle to breathe, and that is that breathlessness that limits their exercise performance. The American College of Cardiology have acknowledged that the two-day CPET can document functional capacity on test one, and then on test two, and identify biomarkers consistent with post-exertional malaise. So that's a fairly significant movement that the California Society for the American College of Cardiology have actually published this, and they do specifically state that the two-day exercise test can document functional capacity and post-exertional malaise in cardiopulmonary, in myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome. So these are the sorts of results that we would get from a two-day test. So these are actually real results from a patient. What we have is peak VO2, so that's their peak oxygen consumption. So that's the most oxygen they can provide to active muscles during the test. Test one, we get a figure of 21.1. That's not an extremely low figure. We do see figures much lower than that. That is probably around about where you might get with a person that is deconditioned. However, when they come back on the second day and repeat the test, that person had a 14% drop in performance. So their functional capacity had decreased by 14% at maximum. We also measure oxygen consumption at the ventilatory or anaerobic threshold. So this is essentially the real functional limit at which people can work. So once you exceed your anaerobic threshold, your time working out is going to be limited. So you'll notice if they're interviewing any of the Olympic athletes at the moment that have been in anaerobic events, like gymnastics, the vaulting, or the 100-meter dash, those people really struggle to talk at the end of their event. Essentially, they're suffering dyspnea, breathlessness. So it's a real-world functional measure of how hard you can actually sustain activity. So we got a figure of 10.9 on day one that reduced to 9.3 on day two. That was a 15% reduction in functional capacity. Interestingly, that is the second lowest functional level for a person with cardiovascular disease. So that person would be deemed extremely disabled. Their watts, the amount of power that they were generating at peak, dropped by 5%, but then even more significantly at the anaerobic threshold, their power they were generating on the exercise bike had dropped by 35%. What that shows to us is that we saw an extreme drop in what we call metabolic efficiency. So the very strong suggestion there that this person has a metabolic disorder, that when they have exercised to a certain level, that they fail to recover and they lose efficiency, and that efficiency carries over for days following the exercise test, the exertion. Okay, so now we've got to convert that into a report. So this is typically what we would have written for that individual when we developed a disability report. So low peak oxygen consumption, early onset of consumption at the anaerobic threshold, and that person's symptoms were exacerbated post-activity. And our conclusion was that this indicates significant impairment. We then compare that with some normalized data. So the safe limit for sustained activity, so this is published data here, is an oxygen consumption of around about 5.4 milliliters per kilogram per minute. So that's the amount of oxygen that person would be able to consume during a sustained activity and keep up that activity. When you compare that with the estimated oxygen requirement for seated office or computer work, it's almost identical. So essentially, this person is around about their safe limit for sustained activity, just sitting at a desk, operating a computer. The problem is that even what we call sedentary work isn't really sedentary. So when we look at a normal office task, such as working the photocopier, even getting up to go and fetch a cup of coffee, then once you start to become ambulatory, once you start moving around, the energy costs rise to 10.5 milliliters per kilogram, which was above this person's anaerobic threshold. So I know that's hard to imagine, but it isn't if you've had the illness. So somebody operating a photocopier is expending energy at the same level of exertion as the guys I watched on the rings yesterday at the Olympics. So they're in an anaerobic zone operating the photocopier. That means that they're only going to be able to sustain that for 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes at most before they have to rest and recover. So essentially our conclusion was that even a sedentary job would require more energy than this person can safely sustain without bringing on an exacerbation of symptoms. Next slide, please. Okay, so CPET and ME/CFS. So since we started to do this research and started to produce the disability reports, it's really gained some traction in the scientific community. And a majority of studies, I would say now, are using CPET to actually provoke symptoms in people with ME/CFS. So they actually use it to make the people sick so that they can measure essentially the effects. And a recent study did what's called a meta-analysis of all the CPET studies to date, looking at ME/CFS patients and controls. So essentially it's a multi-analysis of all the studies that have done. And they came up with the same results that us and other people have found with individual studies, that oxygen consumption at workload at both peak output and at the ventilatory anaerobic threshold were lower on the second day in CPET, second day CPET in ME/CFS. Typically what you see with control patients, even deconditioned individuals, there's usually a little bit of a learning effect there, and they do a little better on the second day. And that's what the meta-analysis of all the current studies published showed, that the results were consistent and that they came out with more or less the same results. So the difference between patients and controls was highly significant for workload at ventilatory anaerobic threshold. So remember that, lowered efficiency. And these are the conclusions of the people that produced the meta-analysis, which said they may reflect functional impairment associated with post-exertional malaise. So there we have the objective measurement of reduced function or post-exertional malaise. Okay, changing tack a little bit now. When we started to see some of the consequences of COVID, many people in the ME/CFS field immediately noted that, hey, we've seen this all before. That this looks like ME/CFS. And that's quite widely acknowledged now. So even Anthony Fauci has made the connection between post-COVID illness and ME/CFS. So a large proportion of COVID patients discharged from hospital were experiencing ongoing symptoms: breathlessness, fatigue, anxiety, depression, and exercise limitation. And that was extending 2 to 3 months, and consequently even longer from disease onset. So what was happening to these people? Well, this will be a familiar tale for people with ME/CFS. So this is a person that did not recover from COVID-19. So they have what is now called, in some circles, long COVID or post-COVID illness. So she was sent to see 4 gastroenterologists, an infectious disease specialist, a hematologist, a cardiologist, an ear, nose, and throat specialist, a physiatrist, an integrative doctor, a neuropsychologist, an acupuncturist, and an occupational therapist. She's had an endoscopy, colonoscopy, CT scan, brain MRI, and multiple blood tests. And they're still no closer to curing the long COVID or really finding out what it is. So some people have called the ME/CFS patients the severely studied population. So what have we learned from past viral epidemics? So this is really, this post-viral fatigue type illness is not a new phenomenon. So there are high rates of persistent and often debilitating fatigue that are well documented among survivors from the SARS epidemic, Ebola, Epstein-Barr, which was once thought to be the cause of ME/CFS, numerous influenzas, and then there's a variety of mosquito and tick-borne viruses, Ross River fever being a notable one. Going way back to the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic, it was estimated that 1/5 of survivors of that epidemic never fully recovered, but suffered reduced health with a baseline of chronic fatigue. So is long COVID ME/CFS by any other name? So the clinical and sleep features of chronic post-SARS form a syndrome of chronic fatigue, pain, weakness, depression, with clinical features and sleep features of both fibromyalgia symptom and chronic fatigue syndrome. So this is research that came out following the original SARS epidemic in 2009. And back then, they noted a discordance in the results of pulmonary function testing and exercise testing that didn't seem to link up with the illness itself. So they suggested that CPET would be of use in impairment evaluation, and especially in patients with symptoms inconsistent with the degree of impairment defined by resting pulmonary function testing. So resting pulmonary function testing generally in ME/CFS patients comes up with normal results. It's not until you challenge them physiologically with the CPET test that you start to see the effects in the CPET results. So this was back in 2004 that people were recommending CPET as being useful for post-viral fatigue type illnesses. So unsurprisingly, the scientific and medical establishment has also noted that CPET might be useful for investigating post-COVID complications. And we're starting to see some CPET results from single testing filter through at the moment. And we're hopeful that we'll get a bigger base of scientific results around CPET in the next few months. So the limited number of CPET studies that have been done so far, the CPET was stopped in the long COVID patients due to fatigue, pain, breathlessness, and anaerobic threshold was reached earlier in the patients. Go back to those results from that patient, those ME/CFS patient results that I showed earlier. They mirror that profile almost exactly. Although CPET was used, the breathlessness could not be explained by cardiac, pulmonary, or ventilatory limitation in all patients. So heart was seen to be functioning normally. Breathing seemed to be normal, so ventilation was normal. And so the breathlessness could not be explained by cardiac, pulmonary, or ventricular limitations. What that essentially means from a clinical perspective is you can rule out cardiac disease, you can rule out pulmonary disease, you can rule out a ventilatory disease. So what are we left with? So the gap between peak load and peak oxygen consumption can be explained by an early switch to anaerobic metabolism. So our hypothesis for ME/CFS is that in patients with ME/CFS, the aerobic energy system, the energy system that relies on a constant supply of oxygen to produce energy, is broken. It does not function properly. So the patients have to rely on their anaerobic energy metabolism, which is limited in duration. So muscular deficiency and thus metabolic limitation might contribute to dyspnea in most patients. So this is results from long COVID. These aren't results from ME/CFS, but I hope you can see the similarities there. So what's the take home? So if we go back to the anxiety and distress limitation, we suspect, and we're also starting to see it, that patients with long COVID are being told to, well, go out and exercise. It's all in your head. You just need to get over it. So we're starting to see that psychological attribution to symptoms associated with long COVID. So yeah, you're having a problem breathing and your chest is tight because you're anxious. Our argument is that long COVID, very much like ME/CFS, is that the breathlessness, the dyspnea, is due to biological origins. It has its roots in metabolic function. So rather than time to panic, we're going to say that we have a way to objectively measure impairment in ME/CFS. We strongly believe that this will also prove useful in documenting impairment in patients with long COVID. And Andrew's going to take you beyond the CPET testing now to tell you how he uses those objective results in a disability or impairment claim against an insurance company. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. If I'm lucky enough to get such things, if otherwise we use magic and other tools. So thank you, Dr. Snell, for your presentation. It's so interesting to see how to see a new kind of disability in an area of law which isn't used to new kinds of disabilities, I guess, except last time was ME/CFS. So the presentation itself, if you could go to the next slide, Austin. The presentation is about disability claims related to COVID. And before I kind of explain what I normally explain, first, when we're talking about disability claims related to COVID, there's two types, and I'm only going to talk about one. The two types are the usual type, what I'm going to talk about today, which is because of COVID, you get an illness, aka the long haulers or something of the sort, and you become unable to work. And that's the usual straightforward type of disability claim, compared to the other kind, which is I'm already immunocompromised, COVID-19 is out there, and I can't go to work because if I get COVID-19, I could die. That is also a valid claim, certainly in my eyes. It's a lot more difficult, and I suspect that if people had made that claim or had questions about that claim, it would have happened a little while ago. However, and I kind of have to give two presentations out of both sides of my mouth, but if anybody has questions about this type of claim where you physically could do your job if you were able to do it in a bubble, but it can't be done in a bubble, just email me, and I'm happy to discuss it with you. And the other thing is the presentation you're going to see is geared for just generally disability claims, and there's not going to be too much on the presentation itself which shows the distinctions between long COVID claims, and that's because there really isn't, because, you know, the basics of a claim are the basics of a claim, no matter what's disabling you. And everyone has kind of the same problem if they get stuck, is turning their limitations, their pain, their mental health issues, their cognitive issues, and turning that into evidence to prove to an insurance company, which, as I'm going to explain, has no interest in paying you, and convincing them to pay you when they are not only don't want to, but aren't incentivized to. So long-term disability insurance generally is not Social Security. It is not state disability. It is not a government benefit. What I am talking about specifically is insurance offered by an insurance company, or in rare situations, insurance offered by an employer who creates an insurance fund, but we can put that aside. As the slides point out, you know, it provides income replacement when you become impaired and unable to work. There's premiums paid either by yourself or your employer. If your employer pays it, you should know how it's paid, because whether it's pre or post-tax makes a difference as to how the benefits are taxed. The definition of disability is most commonly defined as the inability to perform one's own occupation. What they will define as your own occupation rarely lines up with what you're actually doing. They're using sources from the government, which, no joke, were last updated between 75 and 95. So they're trying to argue, you know, like a typist, or, you know, someone's job in the 80s is the same as it is today. It's nuts. But thankfully, usually your problems with insurance companies are not going to have to be arguing about your occupation. It happens, but it's less frequent. It's mostly about the medical issues. As you can see, there's an elimination period, which is just an amount of time you have to remain disabled consecutively where you don't get paid in order to initiate the benefits. Common features of long-term disability insurance: a maximum benefit date. These policies almost always provide benefits till age 65 or 67, which is Social Security retirement age. The benefit amount is usually 60 or 66.7%, but it varies. There's lots of things out there. So, but if you can imagine, especially someone from California like me who pays about 35 to 40% in taxes, if you get a 60% benefit from your disability, whether that then gets taxed is a really important question. If it doesn't get taxed, your disability benefits is pretty much the same as you earn in your pocket when you're working. And so the benefits, you know, that's very strong, compared to a 60% benefit, which is then taxed at whatever it needs to be taxed at, making your disability benefits a significant step down from what you were making while earning, and making it a much less desirable benefit. Another feature to pay attention to is the residual disability clauses. Most policies will allow for a partial benefit if you're working part-time or working in a different job which earns you less money, but you usually don't have to be completely 100% unable to work. You just have to meet a earnings loss threshold, or an hours threshold. Usually, if it's an earnings threshold, it's a 20% or less, or 20% or greater loss of earnings. But as I'll just say a few times, you have to look at your policy carefully. Let's see. Okay, so if you have if you have LTD insurance, there are two major frameworks it can fall under. We're not even going to talk about the federal OPM benefits. It still gives me nightmares. We've got ERISA and non-ERISA. So ERISA is a federal law. So if your policy is governed by ERISA, that means it's governed by federal law, ERISA. It still is governed by state law, but only because ERISA says so. Alternatively, your case could be governed by state law, meaning it's not an ERISA case, and that means it's 100% governed by state insurance law. There are a lot of, I'll go into detail about this, but it's important to know what your case is governed by, or what your insurance policy is governed by. If you get your benefits through your employer, you can assume that it's governed by this federal law called ERISA. It's the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. The two main exceptions are if you work for a government entity, any kind of government entity, city, local, federal, state, anything, or you work for a religious organization. Questions arise a lot about hospitals and their religious affiliations. There's a safe harbor listed up there. Don't worry about it. If you see something about a safe harbor, call a lawyer. I couldn't possibly describe it right now. It's just too complicated. The religious organizations, if you happen to know, there's also an exception to an exception where they could choose to opt into ERISA when they wouldn't otherwise. But for the most part, most people, if you get it through your employer, ERISA is the answer to the question. If you buy it through a broker, it's governed by state law. So yeah, if you purchase it from a broker, it's governed by state law. The one weird kind of quirk is that sometimes through your employer, you can purchase individual plans through brokers because it's sponsored by your employer. It's not something that happens in California too often, so I don't see it. But if something like that is happening, well, you've got a law school question-esque issue on your hand, and you'll have to call a lawyer, unfortunately. So if your case is governed by ERISA, it's got, again, a federal law. It's just so you know a little bit of background. ERISA is awful. It was created in the 70s to govern and stop pension managers from raiding pensions, because they apparently were able to raid pensions with no real repercussions. Go figure. So they created this huge law to stop that, and then the Supreme Court got overzealous over 30 years and basically way overexpanded its power, so that it now all of a sudden governs all plans, not just employee pension plans, and it also encroaches into the remedy scheme of state law, which it was never intended to do, which means that the ERISA remedies, which ERISA says you can get, is the only remedies you're allowed to get. So if you have an ERISA case, and it would have been a state law case, and if a state law case, you had a right to a jury. If they owe you $1 million, let's say, if a jury, if you get in front of a jury and win, a jury could award you $11 million, let's say. And so an insurance company, when they're bean counting, they know, wow, we're really bad to this person. We could end up, paying an extra $10 million. We do that 100 times, it'll be a really bad year. We can't be bad to this person. It's bad business. So they don't do it. In ERISA, the only remedies available are the right to recover the benefits which are entitled to you. I know this isn't on the slide yet, but this paints everything, and it should really come first. They're only required to pay you what they owed you up to that day, and potentially attorney's fees. And what this does is basically create a situation akin to if our criminal justice code were to change, where bank robbers were only punished by having to give the money back if caught, and a little bit of interest. What that would do to the bank robber industry in America. Everyone would be robbing banks, because why not? Why not? There's no real incentive not to. If someone comes to me and says they have long COVID from having the disease for a month, there's nothing in their medical record, their doctors are kind of skeptical, there's no way we're paying this claim. Why would we? And you can imagine, it's not just you. Everybody with any ERISA claim faces this massive hurdle and faces this, understanding that there's a massively stacked deck against them. Adding to that, kind of back to the slide, you have to, if you're denied, you have to appeal most of the time. Just assume you do, to the insurance company with all your evidence before you have a right to sue. Once you appeal and they decide, the door closes on them being allowed to, anybody being allowed to introduce evidence. So if you don't know exactly what you're doing, or you don't know that fact, you could not submit all the evidence you need and the door could close. It's a ridiculous part of the law. And there's no juries. Your case is decided by a judge, which it could be good, could be bad, but the bottom line is that you have to get the evidence in, you have to appeal, and then all you can recover are what you're owed up to that day. It's not a way to disincentivize insurance companies to treat claims properly, or to incentivize them to treat claims properly. So yeah, I kind of ranted about this slide. So the big catch: insurance are shielded from damages outside of benefits they owed to you in the first place, and potentially some fees. Your policy often will also offset other benefits you receive, so be careful about that. Workers' comp, Social Security disability, state disability. All those things will reduce your long-term disability benefit, but just for the month you're receiving them. Pay attention to that as well. So, right, if you have state law insurance, just something purchased by a broker, you usually don't have to appeal. You usually want to, but you don't have to appeal. Juries will make the decision on your case, and there are usually no offsets. And they do face the possibility of damages. The problem is these policies are often far more expensive. The bigger problem often can be is that these policies require underwriting, meaning you have to answer questions, and they look into your medical background and they can say no. It really should be described as the benefit of the ERISA group insurance is that there is no underwriting. You just get to sign up with your employment, and if you're someone with a major illness or with other who's filed disability claims before, you couldn't afford non-ERISA insurance because the underwriting would make it so expensive. With the group insurance, you can just sign up and you get it. So, and that's why technically why it's so easy to get and not get easy to get paid. So as far as submitting a claim, let's say you're considering submitting one. First thing you want to do is look at the policy. It's just an overview, right? When you're in the language of the policy, you want to look at the exclusions and limitations. Dr. Snell kind of explained it a bit, and I'll go into more detail. I'll explain a bit how to support the claim, and then some pitfalls to avoid. Okay, so you start with the policy, and you need to look at what coverage you have. Again, we use red. I should use different colors, but if you ever download the slide, this red is a bolden red. Like, really pay attention to it. It's hard to emphasize. The last page of the slide uses red to mean bad, so I'm just framing that for now. I haven't changed it yet, and I apologize. So without your policy, you do not know the rules. If you don't know the rules, you don't know what you're doing. If you do not have your plan or policy, ask for it in writing. If you have employer-sponsored benefits, ask your employer for it in writing. If you bought your policy from a broker, you can either ask the insurance company or you can ask the broker directly. Any method is good as long as you have an ability to certify to track it and make sure it was delivered. Okay, so common exclusions and limitations that impact people with ME/CFS, and that will likely impact you. So first, what I want to, this is kind of out of order, but Dr. Snell addressed the neuromusculoskeletal disorder, the mental nervous disorder. So basically, every policy will have what we call a mental/nervous disorder limitation, meaning that, and they're written in different ways, but if the insurance company can show that your disability is either primarily due to or due to at all a mental health issue as defined, they can limit your benefits to 2 years and don't have to keep paying you past that. Every disability claimant with a physical disability of any kind is threatened by this clause because just about everybody who is disabled has some kind of mental health issues, just because no one is really happy to be disabled. I mean, they have health issues and then they can't be out there being productive in the way they want to. I don't think there's anyone out there who enjoys that, despite like what insurance companies might want to convince people of. So there's often mental health issues linked in with physical issues. And so insurance companies love to just kind of, when they realize they can't deny the claim, fall back on that. And I'll go into more detail with that, but the mental nervous limitations are by far the most. Austin, can you go back? I'm not ready for you to fly forward. Don't rush me. That's perfect. Just leave it there. That's awesome. So these mental nervous limitations are by far the most common in these policies. It will be in almost every policy unless you have a really high paying private policy. And it's the most commonly used because it's the easiest for them to use to drop their guard and say, oh, you're just disabled because of this, not this. So pay attention to those. However, these other clauses are becoming more prevalent and should be also be paid a lot of attention to as well. The other class is objective evidence requirements / subjective symptom limitations. They're the same thing with a different name. It's basically them saying if there's no objective evidence, and that's why Dr. Snell was so heavy on objective, if there's no objective evidence, then they don't have to pay your claim past 2 years. You might be thinking, well, who defines what's objective? Sometimes they put it in the policy, but even when they put it in the policy, it's usually nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. And most of the time they don't. So we argue about what's objective. And it becomes, often a very significant fight because, well, these are rarer. These limitations right here are rarer. They are easier to implement against people with ME/CFS and fatigue related issues. We're having a lot of success using 2-day CPET to combat them with people with ME/CFS. But certain carriers in certain states just don't, they'll bury their head in the sand anything. So, but it's just important to have that kind of framework in mind. And so you can go forward, Austin. I'm not sure if this one, okay, forward. Okay, go back. Just go back. Go back. Okay, so blank slate. It's fine. That's fine. So this one's missing a big bullet point. It should be ME/CFS limitations and fatigue syndrome limitations. Only a few insurance companies have them right now, but I'm starting to see them have them a lot more frequently. They kind of blew up the last 3 years. I've been seeing them everywhere. I am really eager to litigate one just because they're written so poorly. One just says chronic fatigue syndromes. I have still no idea what that means, and neither do they, because their doctors use different definitions. But be very mindful when you're reading a policy that there's not a chronic fatigue syndrome limitation in there. If there is, no matter what you call your illness, call a lawyer first, because you'll want help kind of guiding what argument you're going to make, and you want to know what you're going to call it the next year to bolster your case. And yeah, there we go. So now you can move forward, Austin. Sorry. Okay, so to support your claim, the first thing you want to do is complete the forms that are filled out. They'll ask for you to fill out a form, your doctor to fill out a form, and your employer to fill out a form. People ask me all kinds of questions about what their employer is supposed to fill out. They're really just supposed to be like robotically reproducing information, salary information, years worked. It shouldn't be an issue. If it is an issue, give someone a call because it's often hard to fix. The claimant's, your statement is a really good opportunity for you to tell your story. You and your doctor should not feel limited to what the insurance company decides they want to know. If they give you 3 lines to explain, one thing and you want to use 6, just tack a supplement on at the end, write a novella, just make sure you're referencing things in the back or, just make sure the information's there. They're supposed to read it. But you'll see forms that you'll almost laugh. It's like, how am I supposed to get all this information like on one line or one little checkbox? And don't try. Just type something out or write at the end. Make sure you see your attending physician's state, if you can, make sure you see what your attending physician fills out on their statement before it's sent to the insurance company. Especially the first time. You don't have to do it every time because you don't want to bother your doctor and you want to conserve that energy. But the first time you want to make sure they're doing it right and that they're getting everything right. Also, and I'm sure I'll say this again later, but in the course of doing that, request your own medical records first before they go to the insurance company. Because you want to make sure it is not missing anything or incomplete. These doctors often will happily change things. HIPAA requires them to if it's totally inaccurate, but if you want them to. So it's all about picking and choosing your battles sometimes with the doctor and getting your records completed. So people also ask, they often want to ask questions about the authorization for release of medical information. Usually, the question is like, do I really have to allow them access to this, and this? And my answer is always the same. It's practically, there's almost no reason they would actually get any of that. It's a boilerplate form they ask everyone for. Unfortunately, what I can promise you is if you try to modify it, they're going to want whatever you're trying to modify. They're going to think you have something. So it's counterproductive to try and alter it. And not filling it out might get them to stop the claim altogether. So you're really kind of stuck with it. And if there is something you really want to protect, because, knowing it might impact your claim, I would talk to an attorney. But unfortunately, it's a lot easier to just give up the sense of privacy now because they get very invasive if you want to get your claim paid. It's unfortunate, but they'll also interview telephonically. They'll just spend an hour asking you questions. A lot of it will just make sure that you're actually saying what you said on the claimant statement. With the telephonic interview, before we go to the medical records, one thing I tell my claimants to do or tell people to do, either ask them if you can record the session or if they'll be recording it, And if they'll be recording it, ask for a copy. If they say no, then say you need your own recording. You just want, you don't get to see what goes in the claim file unless you're denied and you request the file. That's the only chance you get it. Otherwise, you have no idea what they've just reported to the insurance company you said for an hour, and you want to be able to like verify that. Alternatively, you send them a letter after saying, this is what I recall from the conversation. Let me know if there's anything here that differs from your, okay, thank you, Austin. That differs from my recollection. You just want to try and verify information in writing as much as possible. Thanks, Austin. You want to keep that draft? No. Check. Make sure provide a roadmap to all your medical records after you've requested them. Review them yourself. Make sure everything is in there, and then you can provide summaries and things like that. So, the policies usually pay for the first 2 years. Most policies will pay if you can't do your own occupation for the first 2 years. While they may, kick and fuss, it's really important, especially for us lawyers, for litigating, to have a detailed job description to show what you actually do and not what they say you do. Because the insurance company's definitions are, they just don't account for the real world marketplace. And if you're not able to do your job and they say you can do this job, there's obviously some disconnect there. And this is obviously usually something that's a lot easier to explain to judges. It's like, Your Honor, we use computers now in 2021. Like in 1978, using abacuses. Sorry but it's the point we try and make where it's different than it was. You support your claim, by letting them know that you can provide Social Security awards. You really have to. State disability awards. All of those things show that you've been awarded disability from, a reliable third-party entity. Social Security is big. Performance reviews from your employer showing that you are good at your job is really good. Personal statement can be helpful. Diaries. Don't go overboard in the statements. Because often if they're not impressive, they can as a whole look impressive. But if there's someone like a spouse who's seen you through it all, or a boss who's supportive, it's good to get something really good from someone like that. That's what I find. It's always better to have like one or two really good ones than like 6 or 7 medium ones. So, your doctor does not have to be a specialist in your condition. If they are, it helps. If they're not, it does help that they refer to the specialist records. You do never have to be supported by one kind of doctor or another. Any kind of MD will do. You just make sure you see this MD. You don't want to get supported by the one doctor you only see once a year, even if they're relying on other doctor's stuff. You want to be seeing this person regularly. Make sure you document medication side effects. It's not always documented, especially in long relationships. If you want a second opinion, go for it. Doctor shopping, I'm not too worried about it because you have to actually find someone. And make sure your doctor actually understands what your job entails if you're having, any issues getting them to sign off on disability or anything like that. If they offer suggestions early on, it's often helpful to take them. They say, oh, why don't you try cutting back to part-time, or why don't you try this special device? Try all of those things, and then you can go back to your doctor and say, look, I tried it, it didn't work. It not only convinces your doctor, but, convinces the judge or the insurance company, like, of all the things you tried. So, well. Yeah, so, if when you're talking to your doctor, make sure if you're saying you're same as last time, kind of make sure to re-explain your limitations, because often someone can just say that, they're same as last time, they're fine, and the insurance company can use it against them. So certain pitfalls to avoid, overstating your restrictions and limitations on social media. There's nothing good that comes out of social media use unless you are intentionally using it to highlight your disability. It's something to just give up on if you can, because no matter what, all it takes is one picture out of 100 for them to kind of throw up there and say, look what she was doing on this day, look what she said she was doing this day. And all it takes, is a little bit of damage to your credibility, and then we're in a lot of trouble. That's the biggest thing that can harm your disability claim, is it impact your credibility. However, it's often, if you have good days and bad days, a lot of that can be alleviated, but I'll go into detail about it. If you have physicians who aren't helpful and you see that in the records, you may have to just give up that doctor and find someone else if they're not willing to help you, either with forms or filling out the form, the medical record the way you need. So yeah, you can go through this one, Austin. If you are being asked questions or interviewed or filling out forms, just never say never. Always avoid saying always. Like, for example, it's always I never drive is what people say. And, I know the one day you're going to feel up to driving is when they're going to be interviewing you or surveilling you. So try and qualify things like that, and make sure you tell them about your good days and bad days. There's no reason to hide them. Make sure you're honest about them, because that also has the effect of mitigating any surveillance they really do, because you can just say, hey, I was having a good day, which is usually the truth. So, again, social media is just not good. Be mindful that other people can tag you. Even if you think you've blocked consent to tag you, they can manually tag you. So be mindful of where you're going out and who's taking pictures of you. If you're on LinkedIn, don't go looking for jobs, because that can also be public. And that can tip off an employer, and you don't have to explain that you're job hunting before you are ready to, because you don't know how serious it is, and they'll assume it's super serious. So just be careful what you're doing, everything on social media, and assume that they're looking to get you on something, because they are. So sorry, I'm running over time. I'm assuming that's okay. Austin will hit me with a hammer or something, and if it's not, we'll stay for questions as long as we need to. I will. I'm sure Dr. Snell will too. So once you submit your claim, the insurance company will try to reach out to your physician directly. Try to ask your doctor to kind of relay that they'll only respond in writing to questions. The first time around, it's not always so important, but you just don't know what they're recording about what the doctor's saying. So again, if you can get it in writing, that's great. The insurer will order your medical record. So again, make sure you've done it first so you know what they're going to see. Ask the insurer directly that if they're going to reach out to your doctors, do it in writing. They may ignore you, but it's good to have that request in writing. They may ask for a IME, which is an independent medical examination, to send you to someone in person. This is not always the case, but for people with fatigue-related issues and unique issues like long COVID, it is a big red flag. It's because they kind of know that they're not going to find anything, and they can look to a judge and say, but Your Honor, we sent her to a doctor in person and we spent so much money on it. Like, what else are we possibly supposed to do? And there are judges out there who will believe that. So if you have a fatigue related illness of any kind and you're getting sent to an in-person IME by the insurance company, I'd call a lawyer beforehand to get ready for it. If there's ways that can help. There are. So the law of ERISA appeals, basically, if you are given a denial letter, it'll give you a deadline to appeal. Do not miss the deadline. Do not miss the deadline. Do not miss the deadline. There's law out there that says, assuming they've written the policy properly, according to their terms, if you do not do this timely, you can't litigate. And if you do not want to be in that situation where you can't sue them because you didn't file an appeal on time. If you're denied, also request a copy of your claim file, because it'll have everything in there. Request it in writing, follow up every 45 days. There ironically isn't a requirement that they give it to you within any particular time. There is for the plan or policy. Just follow up with them every 45 days and you'll usually have it. So the appeal letter itself, there's a lot of philosophies out there about how to handle them. Most lawyers that aren't me and most lawyers who don't work at Kantor and Kantor do this. What I've seen is they put a very detailed letter together identifying all the mistakes and all of the law, and they just throw everything at them, at the insurance company before litigation. And, you know, sometimes that works, of course, but I've seen what it can do so often is give the insurance company a roadmap of just what they need to ignore and what they need to justify. Like, it just shows them the landmines they need to avoid in order to actually make the denial better, because I'm convinced that certain cases are going to deny no matter what. So in my philosophy is, again, contrary to many other lawyers out there, is that the letter doesn't really matter. It's almost entirely about the substance of the evidence. And if you've done your job right and you've done the perfect appeal, every single thing you've wanted to say in that letter is said factually by an expert or your client, or, you know, you obviously, because there's nothing that a lawyer can argue better about a medical condition than a doctor. There's nothing a lawyer can argue better about a vocational condition than a vocational expert. And so it's about to me, the reason you need a lawyer at this stage is not to write the appeal letter. It's to know what evidence to get. And that, of course, both are important. But it can be complicated for a lot of reasons. So it's always important to talk to a lawyer when you can, before you start doing it too much on your own. You know, the next one, Austin. So what do you do if the appeal is denied? Again, find a lawyer, find someone who offers free consultations, because, you know, there's no reason for you to pay for a consultation. You know, most know the difference between a contingency fee arrangement where we take a percentage of what we win on your behalf and an hourly arrangement. We almost exclusively do contingency fees because most people are better served by that. If you're a really wealthy individual who has cash on hand, you could be served by an hourly fee. It just depends on your situation. But just know the difference and know what's going to suit you. For most people, that is a contingency. So, okay, the Department of Insurance is red here, not to embolden it because it's such a great idea, but because it's supposed to express caution. You can write to the Department of Insurance if you are denied, and they will reach out to the insurance company and wag their finger at them and say, hey, you explain what you've done here in this denial. And then what they'll do is they'll give it to their best people and they'll explain what they've done there. And they'll give them like a perfect rebuttal document for the entire case. And that we basically, you know, we have to now deal with. And then nothing will change. Nothing will happen. Nothing will be different. They'll just have the opportunity, in my opinion, this is all I've seen. They'll just have the opportunity to put this perfect summary rebuttal document written by their best people into the file. So I would definitely talk to a lawyer before the Department of Insurance. And if you're denied, once the appeal is denied, the only thing to do next is litigate. You can request the claim file again, and you'll get another copy. So the last thing is that you may have concurrent claims going on at the same time. That's totally normal and expected. Social Security disability kind of happens along the way. We do not do any Social Security, so I can't give you any advice on it. But, you know, knowing enough that I do, file the claim timely. Don't, you know, meet all your deadlines. And if you do need help finding a lawyer that has this kind of specialty with CFS or long COVID, let me know. I know a few lawyers who are focusing on it. A life insurance waiver or premium claim allows you to keep your life insurance in force even after employment ends. That's the biggest benefit of it. Often people don't know they have it, or it's been made for them. So ask your employer about it. And if you know you're about to make a claim, make sure you just make the claim, even if you're not sure if you have it, because then they can just say, sorry, you don't have it. No big deal. You may have other benefits like deferred compensation, which vest. I don't see those enough to know much about them, but it's worth to pay attention, see what you can get from there. And so, you know, final thoughts. My dad always, you know, one of the first truisms my father taught me, one of the first like real pieces of knowledge he gave me is that you can always rely on insurance companies doing one of two things: either denying more claims because the economy's good, or denying more claims because the economy's bad. And he's right, and he is, because whenever anything happens to shock the system, insurance companies start denying more claims. That's what they do. I am seeing more general claim denials that I wouldn't have expected before, not related to ME/CFS or long COVID, but that means to me that they're anticipating a lot more claims or, you know, another shock to the system. You know, when I'm advising people about these claims, one thing that most people are a little surprised about is how little we focus on the diagnosis compared to how much we're focusing on proving the actual impairment. I don't need to prove that you have long COVID if I can prove that you have such debilitating fatigue that you can't get out of bed 2 out of 3 days. For most people, the link is so important to them, and I understand that, and their physicians and going forward. But for the insurance company, all you have to do is meet that burden that you can't do the job. So we're ready. I feel like we feel very ready, especially with Workwell's help, to handle these kind of claims, and to help other people handle them. Because it's all about getting into the evidence and really proving the disability. I mean, no matter what the cause, it's about proving the disability. So, and as I said, that's why COVID claims will be denied. One thing I want to notice, especially for the lawyers, if you're trying to use CPET to prove disability, make sure you're using a 2-day CPET. From Workwell or Ithaca, I don't know if there's any other labs out there that do it. 1-day CPET is not good for proving impairment. I had one of my favorite lawyers on the other side throw a thing of documents at me saying, these all say that CPET's useless for disability, huh? What do you say now about your special test? And I showed him what a number 2 was and wrote it on the board for him, and he wasn't very impressed. But there's a ton of evidence out there that 2-day CPET is really good for disability. There's just as much that 1-day CPET is not. So be careful what you're using and what you're arguing for what purpose, because you don't want to get tripped up on that. And yeah, that's a final thought. So and I wish I had concluded on something a little more dramatic, but here are questions and answers. I hope you enjoyed our little chat. If have any questions for Dr. Snell and I, if you haven't written them in the chat or they arise later, feel free to reach out to us. I'm sure at some point Dr. Snell and Austin will join me. So just leave me to be the pretty one.
Actually, hi, we have several questions, and it kind of just depends on how long people can hang around.
Well, let me first blaze through if you don't mind, the ones I already saw a question on the right that I can answer quickly, so I don't waste too many people's time. So first, Tracy Morin, I like your question. So the answer is I'm not seeing that. The question is at the top. In private disability claims that are approved, are insurers typically requiring patients to repeat the 2-day CPET in order to demonstrate continuing disability? And if so, how much? So you are always required to prove impairment. However, what I've seen is that the 2-day CPET serves to kind of confirm everything else as far as function, like the evidence that your impairment is functionality. And so it's from what I've seen, if you have the same supporting evidence that you've always had, the CPET's not going to be something they require frequently, at least not in my experience. Because it's more like, okay, well, once we've seen the CPET means this medical at the time means she's disabled. If this medical at the time is the same medical as it is going forward, the medical alone should be enough. But that's kind of a distinction with the CPET, because mostly I can go into detail about that, but that's something unique with the CPET. So I'm not seeing them require it that often. I think the one exception is I have one client where they asked him to repeat. Basically, we decided that they insinuated it 7 years later. But beyond that, not really. And if you have a lawyer, I think you can push back on it. Just, from what I know there are rumors or there's fears that the CPET can cause troubles. We can use that to protect you from having to do it repeatedly, or you can use it to protect yourself. But the answer is not very frequently. To Noah, the answer to the question is yes. I have worked with lots of patients with tick-borne disease. The symptoms overlap a ton. And as I was just saying, it's really more about proving the symptoms and proving limitations than it ever is about the source of the impairment. So it's seamless for us, really. So that's 2. I'll give you 2, Dr. Snell.
Yeah, just to add to that, Andrew, am I coming through?
Yep.
Okay. I actually do the disability reports blind to diagnosis. So I've asked that don't tell me what this person's been diagnosed with. So I find if I then have to do a follow-up, it makes for a stronger argument. against any bias in favor of ME/CFS. So it's an objective test of impairment. It's not a disease diagnostic test, although it can aid in diagnosing particular illnesses. A couple of questions that I saw flashing up that I'll cover. I know a lot of people are concerned about the long-term effects of the 2-day CPET test. And we're very open and upfront about it. It is designed to bring on symptoms. That's what it does. I wish we didn't have to do it. I wish it was sufficient just for the person to say, this is my symptoms, this is what I can and can't do, and be believed. But unfortunately, with the insurance company situation, that's not the case. I understand that anecdotally, there are some patients who say that they get worse and they've never recovered from CPET. That it is only anecdotal evidence. There is no scientific study to show that. So, but clearly there is some risk. The test itself, it's called a maximal test, but it lasts from 8 to 12 minutes. And you're probably above your anaerobic threshold for no longer than 3 minutes. And when you look at the energy consumption during the test, lots of people do things in their everyday lives that are the equivalent of a CPET test. Yes, they're going to be sick afterwards, but to live your life, sometimes you have to do things that you know are going to make you ill. It's better to be prepared to rest and recover following the test. Don't try and get back into your life immediately after the 2-day test, because that's just going to compound the effects. But as I say, there's a limited number of patients, to my knowledge, that have indicated they do not recover from the test. However, the majority of our patients, even though they may be sick for 7 days, 2 weeks, they do. And we get a lot of patients that say how helpful it was and how useful it was, that compensated for some of the downside. Increasingly when we do these, we're getting questions about medication. Just a disclaimer up front, I'm not a physician, I'm an exercise scientist. And the medication routine for many people with fatiguing illnesses is a wonder to behold. And many of these medications are for other conditions other than ME/CFS, and the effects they have are not the effects that they have on the conditions that they were originally prescribed for. We don't require that people come off medication prior to the test. We do ask that people give us a detailed description of what they're taking. Usually I will not address that in the report, other than just to make a little notation that certain medications can affect heart rate, for example. I don't want to give the insurance companies too much information. Sometimes they will follow up and make the argument that the medication is causing the symptoms. Well, it can be a difficult one. Usually we will argue that if somebody's been prescribed a medication by a physician, it's presumably to make them better. So we can only assume that if they weren't taking the medication, the CPET test would be worse. What I do say is that patients should review their medications periodically with the physician, just to make sure that they're not keep getting medications added, to make sure that the dosages are correct. And look at their symptoms and look at the side effects of the medication. And the problem is that some of the medications that people take, when you look at the side effects look like ME/CFS symptoms. So antipsychotic drugs side effects, have side effects that look like orthostenic intolerance very often. So review your medication with a physician periodically, check the dosages, maybe take a medication vacation every now and again, just to see what happens when you come off the medication. Did you spot any more questions that I can address here? So that they were sort of flashing by, and I probably missed a whole bunch of them as they were coming up.
Excuse me.
One person said, given how important the 2-day CPET seems to be for a disability claim, what should people do if for whatever reason you don't want to or you can't? First, a 2-day CPET is only, it's important, but it's not necessarily the only way to prove disability. My usual next question is, okay, are you impaired cognitively? Are you having cognitive impairment? Is it harder to think? Most people's answer is yes, and noticeably so. So in that case, I try and go the cognitive route and try and get a neuropsych report or any other evidence of cognitive impairment. And that can be enough often if I'm able to get a supportive neuropsych report. Well, some people that financially isn't feasible because a neuropsych report is, can be anywhere from 4 to 7 times the cost of a 2-day CPET. And not to mention the cost of the rebuttals and things like that you may need down the road. So it really depends. If assuming you can't or don't want to do the 2-day CPET, there are definitely other routes to go depending on your limitations and restrictions.
For more information on the CPET, rather than us take up a lot of time here, the best thing you can do is contact Jared at Workwell. So the website address is there. He will walk you through the process for CPET from soup to nuts. And so he will explain everything in detail so you can make the best judgment about whether the test is going to be appropriate for you. I did see a question flash up about whether insurance companies require CPET. Surprisingly not. Maybe they don't want it to show that the person's impaired.
There you go.
It would actually show if they're not. Now, one thing I have had thrown at me is that, well, every report you do shows the person's impaired. And I have made the case, well, actually, you only see the reports where the person's impaired because we don't write the ones where they're not. So you're paying for the test. We will give you a heads up, or your attorney a heads up, if we don't think the test results are going to be helpful. If they're not going to be helpful, you don't want the test on record. You don't want the report written.
And just so you know, my response to the insurance company was, why don't you guys start sending some of your claimants on your dime over to Workwell, and you'll get the reports, and then you'll see how fair-handed he is. Oh no, they're not going to do that. They don't set to put that in perspective. Insurance companies will pay to send people to neuropsychs and FCEs. They aren't doing it as much anymore. An FCE is a functional capacity evaluation designed to prove physical limitations. They'll often send people to those. But they won't ever send someone to a 2-day CPET. Because in reality, they know for the most part that the evidence is going to be supportive, and they know that they have neuropsychologists who work for them. They have FCE therapists who they know work for them, even if they're technically independent, they're just never going to do it. And that's a compliment to Dr. Snell and Workwell. I mean, speaking of, so someone was asking, so what are other investigative tools and tests useful improving disability due to ME/CFS or fibromyalgia? So I've pretty much listed the big 3. 2-day CPET, neuropsychological reporting, which confirms cognitive impairment, and functional capacity evaluations, which are designed to prove physical limitations. Those are the 3 big areas of testing that we get from a medical perspective. And to give you any more than that, letters from your doctors are really helpful. Some supporting statements can be helpful. If you get Social Security, that's a question. That's basically my job, is proving disability claims. So there's lots of things I could tell you. If you get denied or ever get stuck, let me know. So can I explain more about the life insurance premium benefit when on LTD? So yes, technically, it's not a benefit while on LTD. It is something that happens totally concurrently and separately from your life insurance policy. So your LTD policy will have a definition of disability, and you'll get paid based on that. And then totally separately, your life insurance policy will have a different definition, which will say, if you're this disabled under this definition, we will also continue to waive your life insurance premiums. Now, meaning you don't have to pay the couple $100 a month, which is good, of course. But the bigger thing is that it allows you to keep that insurance in force, when the alternative would be, once your employer terminates you, you'd have to pay conversion premiums, which is for most people astronomical and unfeasible. The big downside of the, what we call it an LWOP, life insurance waiver of premium, and I'm like having trouble stopping myself from calling that. The problem with the LWOP is that the definition is often much stricter. So it'll say something like, if you're unable to perform any occupation for wage or for compensation on even a part-time basis, then you get the benefits. So basically they're saying, if you can't pull off, 2 hours a week or 2 hours a month, doing clerking work or something like that, then you qualify. So it's a much harder argument. But you should look to your life insurance policy for details on that. And basically everything, the rules I've said here for LTD, I think everything applies to life insurance as well. But you definitely talk to a lawyer if you have concerns. So I only see 2 more questions here. I'll just take them real quick. When LTD meets the 2-year mark for not being able to do your own occupation, do you then have to prove you can't do any job, including low effort and low paying jobs like a store greeter, for example? It's the famous question, does the basketball superstar have to be a Walmart greeter? It depends on the language of your policy, and it depends on your state. For the most part, the answer is no. For the most part, the any occupation definition will incorporate a income floor. So the most common in California is that you basically, they have to find you a job which makes you as much money as they're paying you on disability. And they call it the gainful wage threshold. But again, you got to look at your policy, because every policy is different. And look for the language about what they call a gainful wage or a gainful policy or gainful occupation. Okay. Couldn't a supportive neuropsych report end up triggering the nervous mental 2-year limitation, even though the real reasons are cognitive issues? Yes, but usually this problem only arises if you utilize a neuropsychologist who is not experienced with disability issues. If you get someone experienced with disability issues, they should know what a mental nervous limitation is, and before writing the report would say, look, I think your cognitive issues are due to your ADHD, 100%. And I think that the insurance company could use this, to limit your benefits. Are you sure you want me to write this report? And sometimes you can't get around it because you're getting a neuropsych through your insurance, or it's been ordered. But often I'm finding that you have to go and get it yourself, or at least ask for it. And so if you're going to get it yourself anyways, it's better to go kind of outside, pay cash for someone knows what you're trying to do. And so when you say supportive, a supportive neuropsych says that your cognitive issues are due to physical issues. And I'll tell you, it's very, very hard. I think that the association you're making is a lot rarer than you'd think it is. I don't think I can remember the last time I saw any opinion from either side saying someone's mental health issues were so severe that they were causing valid and discernible cognitive impairment from no other source. It's just not like, there's usually something else going on. And so the combo of that being the fact, hopefully it wouldn't happen. But again, it's something that is usually benefited by making sure you have a neuropsychologist who knows the disability area.
It's really a cognitive health issue that's being assessed, not a mental health issue. I mean, in truth, any mental effect has a physiological cause, but We're looking at slowed information processing, slowed reaction time. None of these things can be explained by a mood disorder in the same way that depression does not explain CPET results. So generally where they make the link is they're going to say, well, depression is related to fatigue. And we know that it is, that people who are depressed tend to feel tired. However, it's not a metabolic disorder, so it's not going to be indicative. It's going to be a perception of fatigue, not an objective measure of a metabolic deficit that's causing a low efficiency. So whenever you do anything, you're working harder than anybody else to get it done because you're not very efficient, and that's why you're tired. So as Andrew said earlier, that if the insurance company is paying for the medical examination, then in my experience, it's unlikely to be helpful. It's unlikely to be helpful. Read into that what you will, but it's the old adage, you get what you pay for. And if you're not paying for it, then you probably don't get very much out of it.
Let's see. Oh, what's the difference between the CPET and the iCPET? Do you want this one, Dr. Snell?
Yeah, the ICPET, they stick a needle in you and they monitor blood. We measure exhaled gases. The ICPET is an invasive CPET, and they're looking at metabolites in blood. Very interesting scientifically. I don't have a lot of experience with the test. I have looked at a couple of ICPETs and that people have had done where they've also had a regular CPET. And I didn't see any more in the test that would make the report any better from an impairment perspective. So it sounds sexier that, you know, you've got a hard line inserted and you've got blood flowing through it. So it's an extra invasive process that if it's not necessary, then why would you put yourself through it? So yes, it's there. It's going to be helpful because if it's done properly, it'll give us the same results that we get with a gas exchange. But do you need to do it? I guess.
As far as iCPET, if you want to do it medically, if there's any medical reason for it, go for it. There's no disability reason to do it. It's too advanced. Well, I shouldn't say that. It could be like, if we put a lot behind it, it could be like a massive bomb at the end of a case, like dropping it on them. But it's my estimation. First of all, I would never tell a client to do it because it not only involves a needle, it's a main line, like an arterial line they have to put in. And so that's like terrifying to me. And we can never tell a client to have to do that for a case. So I'm not recommending it. I've also seen a few and submitted them. The insurance companies, I mean, they're so behind. They're barely digesting the 2-day CPET, just barely starting to chew on it. The iCPET is just maybe too advanced for them. And I certainly would not want someone to do it just for disability because there's just the cost benefit, because I'm pretty sure it's expensive as well, of that compared to like a 2-day CPET at a neuropsych. I mean, there's just no question. So I wouldn't be thinking about it for disability at all. Let's see. Is that everything? So, someone asked a question. Their employer eliminated their position while I was in the 6-month waiting period. What 6-month? Oh, was it the 6-month eligibility period? Huh? So, Marty, if you are eligible for short-term disability, you should also be eligible for LTD. If your employer eliminates your job while you're off work, your LTD benefits should not be impacted because everyone eventually gets terminated. So the only thing that matters is if you have LTD coverage on the day you make the claim, and if the only question there is if you're working, is if you've worked long enough to meet the policy eligibility period, because they want you to work for a certain amount of time before you're covered. And I think the STD and LTD eligibility periods are the same. So my advice to you, Marty, is file the LTD claim. There's no harm in it, and you should definitely file it if Lincoln doesn't do it for you. And that's really applies to anyone. If you're questioning if you have eligibility or coverage, there's really very little harm in just filing a claim and letting the insurance company deny you. So I'm talking with Michael in the chat. Michael, if you can hear me, I don't know of any long-term disability policy that only covers 1 year. I'm sure it exists, but most likely the own occupation period only covers a year. But it might cover more past that. So when you're asking a lawyer, when you're asking me, oh, is my case worth litigating? The numbers I'm using, I always assume that the first year is going to be basically nothing because of California state disability. The numbers question, if you're still out of work, is how much in benefits could you possibly get if you're disabled due to the end of the policy, which is usually 65. So I'd be curious to see your policy. And if it's to age 65, you certainly should continue to litigate your case, because the $8,000 valuation is only a very small piece of that puzzle, because the real valuation is the future, of course, assuming it is more than a year. But you can email me. Austin, did we put our email addresses up so everyone can see us and email us?
Yes, it's in the very beginning, but I will follow up a comprehensive follow-up email that includes all the contact information we need, as well as the slides and the recording and the paperwork we need for the attorneys on the line too. So,
of course, great.
I did see a question, somebody asking about being required to repeat the CPET after a 2-year period. And my understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew, the insurance company won't require you to repeat a CPET, but they may require you to resubmit the claim. And so sometimes we will see a patient that we've already tested 2 years ago, that the attorney has referred them back to us because they've got to resubmit the claim. And the question was about what do we typically see? Will the person have improved? Will they have got worse? It's highly variable. Usually what we see is there's not a great difference between the two tests. And what that suggests to me, because ME/CFS can be degenerative in terms of function, is that being off work and being able to rest and being able to control the crashes, being able to avoid that PEM, then that tends to benefit the patients. And usually they function at a slightly higher level, or they will maintain the level that they were at when they stopped work. But the other problem is, of course, that just because you have ME/CFS doesn't mean that you don't have other conditions. And so certainly if you're forced into a sedentary lifestyle, it can have a knock-on effect. But I don't think insurance companies require the 2-day CPET. If they do require resubmission, then the lawyer may ask that you repeat the CPET. It's probably not going to be harmful to you in terms of the claim to do that. Somebody else asked if we were moving closer to Seattle. Unfortunately, there are 3 of us. We are now doing testing in Arizona. Otherwise, at the moment, it's Ripon or Arizona, or I don't know whether Becky in Ithaca has started up testing again on the East Coast or not. But a limited number of people do the 2-day CPET. Sometimes when you get it done somewhere else, they don't do it properly, and the results aren't always helpful. But there's no reason other people can't do it. It's not, It's exercise science, not rocket science.
Did we get all the questions? I think it's everything.
I think that's
I think it's everything, Austin.
I think that's a good way to stop it. And thank you, Andrew and Dr. Snell. And as I said, I will be following up with a recording, the slides and some more contact information and maybe some substantive links, etc. So thank you all again.
Thank you.
Good one.